Thank you everyone for staying until the very end. Hopefully this will be short and sweet. And and hopefully like dessert, you have a supper stomach for dessert, right? So I hope your brain's not too fried and you have a supper brain to understand what I'm going to tell you right now. So for a long time, my lab was working on different aspects of cognitive modeling, different cognitive functions like attention, perception, inhibitory control, learning and decision making. And so why are we talking about faces today? Well, there was something unsatisfying about the stimuli that tend to be used in these classical experiments, namely they're simplistic and artificial. We use fairly simple stimulus and experimental design in order to make them easy to interpret, so you can control the different confounding variables and so on and so forth. But the downside is that we don't have much complexity. And to me, if you want to understand the full complexity of human intelligence and how the brain works, then we need something a little more complex. And so face images represent a nice compromise between complexity and interpretability, because they're rich and realistic. They're important for real-life processing and interactions. And with the help of modern computer vision and machine learning, we can actually have models-based processing that allow us to have a cake and eat it too. Oh no, I guess I'm thinking about dessert a lot today. So you have both complexity and interpretability. And you get a nice side benefit that also allows you to study social cognition, since faces are so essential for that aspect of cognition. So what do you see in a face? The first thing that might occur to you is this someone I know, or does it look like someone I know? And you might also consider what are the demographic traits, the race, gender, and age of the person you're looking at. And the emotional state, does this person look happy, sad, or angry? And social traits, is this a trustworthy, intelligent, attractive-looking person, or something else? So in fact, with a glance, just 1 second, you can glean most of this information if you wanted to. So we're highly specialized for extracting very complex information out of faces very quickly. That's not to say humans are arbitrarily good at random visual tasks, right? So for example, for finding breast cancer cells, even not state-of-the-art machine learning algorithms are already far better than trained pathologists. But even babies, a 7-month-old, will show you that they prefer looking at trustworthy looking faces. So these are babies that are pre-verbal, and they show that they look longer at faces that adults judge to be more trustworthy. And even, in fact, 3-day-old infants prefer looking at more attractive-looking faces. What does that say about human nature? But anyway, so the question that arises is what kind of computation is going on in the brain that allows this kind of process to be going on. And by the way, this is not innate. So it's not as though infants can do this when they're born, but they acquire this ability very quickly. So that says something about the underlying representation and learning process. And there's a reason probably why social face processing is so effective and so well learned. Namely, it's essential for survival and reproductive success. And as such, it represents an opportunity to study human intelligence in its full complexity and glory. So the first part of the talk is about face representation in the human brain. And we start with thinking about how to model the face space, how to model the psychological face representation. So we probably want something like a vector space representation, where if you have 2 different faces, they ought to map to 2 different points in the space. That seems obvious enough. Should be invertible because you want every point in a space to correspond to a face. And ideally, you want to have an algorithm to generate realistic and high-fidelity images. And you also want to capture the sense of perceptual similarity such that Euclidean distance in this space represents the perceived dissimilarity of faces according to human subjects. And ideally, you also want to be interpretable such that you can visualize or examine each feature axis or basis vector. You also want to be reusable such that novel faces can be projected in. And you want to be generalizable such that it supports different types of face-related tasks, like the different ones that I mentioned before in the Steve Jobs image. And finally, hopefully, there's some neural relevance that you can relate to that allows you to say something about how this face representation is actually implemented in the brain. So part of the reason I got very excited about this area of research, so actually I haven't been working on this for a few years, just 1.5 years. But this was large part inspired by actually Ching and Tao's paper in 2017 showing that in the monkey face selective areas, AM, ML, MF, these are face patch areas in the temporal cortex of the monkey, that these neurons in these areas encode axes of the latent variable space of active appearance model. So here's how the model works. There are shape features, which are just the XY landmark location. So if there are 50 landmarks, then there are 2 times 50, 100 features. And then across different faces in a data set, you can average the landmark location, XY coordinates. And then you can warp each face to have the identical landmark location, which is the mean face landmark locations. And then the warped face, its pixel values become the texture feature of the face. And what they showed is actually different face patch areas seem to encode respectively the shape and texture features of this model. And individual neurons seem to encode a single axis and have monotonic tuning and have flat tuning and has flat tuning in the orthogonal axes. So what we did was we took this active appearance model, we trained our own version, and we built this initial face space, which almost has the features of the psychological face space that we want, that I mentioned before on the previous slide. And we took 50 shape features and 50 texture features. These are the PCs. And we did a combined PCA because texture and shape features in this model actually tend to be correlated. And so here are synthetic faces generated from the model. Along PC1, you see it's mainly about luminance. So that reflects lighting, but can also reflect actual complexion differences. And PC2 is just a simple rotation in the plane. And PC3 starts to reflect more structural changes in faces. And so now what we do is we transform this initial face space given to us by this computer vision model to correspond more closely to human perception by getting human similarity judgments of pairs of faces and try to make the Euclidean distance of pairs of points in this transformed space as similar as possible to human judgment of similarity. So we collect a large data set of similarity judgments of pairs of faces. So here are 2 examples of faces that are judged to be low similarity or high similarity by human subjects. Hopefully it's at least visually persuasive that the data is giving us something. And the actual algorithm we're using is called metric learning. So it is allowing a linear transformation of the original face space that allows rotation and reflection of the basis vectors and then rescaling. So it's a linear transformation that minimizes the perceived dissimilarity and the Euclidean distance between 2 pairs of points. And importantly, we include this trace regularization term that allows us to penalize the eigenvalue of the transformation. And what that does is to reduce the number of relevant facial features that are important for judging similarity judgment in this transform space. And we also consider a second model, which instead of using AAM or active appearance model, is a deep neural net. So this is VGG16. And the second last layer of VGG16, so we consider that to be the initial face space. Again, we apply metric learning to try to get a transformer to be as similar as possible to human perception of dissimilarity. And the third method we consider is called multidimensional scaling. This is a classical method in psychology where there's an abstract embedding of the faces. When we take the pairwise similarity ratings of faces and we try to find an embedding of the points for the different faces such that you get the Euclidean distance to correspond to the similarity as closely as possible, but there is no image model, so it's an abstract embedding model. So it's a little hard to interpret and cannot generate new images. And it's also very data intense because it's abstract, and so therefore it's generalizes poorly based on limited data. And it's also hard to project data point in once you've done this embedding. But it's used extensively in psychology, so we include it for comparison. So here's how the different models do. So the baseline comparison is how human ratings predict other humans on the same image pair using correlation coefficients. So it's not 1 because humans are inconsistent and noisy across each other and within themselves. So that's the baseline. That's the dark dashed line. And then if you take a vanilla AAM, that's the computer vision model, without transformation, then you see you can actually get to fairly similar performance with, in correlation coefficient of held out data if you include the first 6 features ordered by largest eigenvalues in the PCA analysis. And then if you transform AAM using this trace regularized machine learning that I talked about, then you can actually do much better than humans in predicting other humans' perception of similarity of faces, right? So this is this dark orange line here. You can see that it actually achieves much higher correlation coefficient. This is actually the best among all the models. And notably, it's also much better than VGG16, which is a deep neural net trained on both ImageNet, which is object recognition, and trained on VGG phase 2, which is face recognition. So this is consonant with finding from Doris Tao's lab. It's not published yet, but by person communication, they have found that actually the neural response in face patch areas are much better explained by AAM and other models that posit this shape texture representation as opposed to convolution neural nets, such as VGG16. And it's obviously also much better than MDS, multidimensional scaling, which overfits very quickly. So another thing to notice is that the similarity judgments are actually very low dimensional. Actually, to account for human similarity judgments of this very large data set of faces, most of the performance comes from just the first 3 features. You get 93% of the overall ability to predict based on just the first 3 features. So what do these features actually look like? So here are actually the first 8 features ordered by how important they are for judging similarity in our model. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And if you look at this, you might notice that the faces generated, synthetic faces generated along all of these featural dimensions appear to be holistic and symmetric with variations in eyes, nose, mouth, and eyebrows. Not so it's part-based, right? It's very holistic. And it's consistent with actually a large number of studies showing that human face processing largely holistic is not part-based. And you might have noticed that race and gender seem to be prevalent variations within the first 1, 2, or 3 featural dimensions. So X here is female faces, and circles here are male faces. And the different colors correspond with different races. So A is for Asian, B is for Black, H is for Hispanic, W is for white. And you can see that, in fact, the top 3 features do reflect race and gender, but also some structural features. While the other axes, the later features, don't differentiate these demographic groups as easily. Interestingly enough, so within the data itself, there's actually strong separation between different genders and races. But actually, perceptually, the way we judge the similarity between pairs of faces, we actually tend to discount differences between gender and race, right? So what appears to be is that within, say, female faces, right, the similarity that differentiates 2 female faces are actually perceptually, subjectively much more salient than the same difference along the same axis when it's a male face and a female face. So we actually discount across category differences along the same featural axes. So next thing we did is try to predict social trait perception. So for example, how attractive or trustworthy a face looks. And for this, we take data from publicly available data sets where human subjects have provided ratings of 1 to 9 of how attractive or trustworthy or kind or friendly a face looks. There are many different traits that we model, you will see. And we just do a linear regression model. So we're fitting a linear plane over the space of the face space that we've fitted using AAM. And we normalize this regression vector beta, which gives what we call linear trait axis. This gives us the direction along which, if you change the facial features a little bit, that will induce the greatest change in human perceived difference in that trait, at least for its linear component. And so if we compare to deep neural net, we'll again see that they have comparable performance in this case. But we compare to humans, then we see that actually the model predicts human ratings on novel faces that the model has never seen before. For most of the traits, especially ones over here, better than how humans can predict other humans on the same face. And this, again, is because humans are noisy within themselves and inconsistent across each other, while our model is an embedding model that can leverage what it knows about nearby faces to make a less noisy prediction. So in the same model, we can predict social trait perception in novel faces. You can project any new face into this model. And for example, this Jennifer Lopez image is predicted to be more confident and more intelligent and less, younger than the average face. So 0 is population mean, and it's in units of standard deviation in terms of the population distribution of faces. And the error bars indicate standard error of the mean. And here's a different image of Jennifer Lopez. It's a very different image, but the social trait perceptions are actually very similar, except for happy. This is obviously a less happy-looking face, and so the model gets that as well. And we can do this for Bill Clinton or yourself. If you want to send your image to my lab, we can do this for you and choose the best website photo for you if you want. We can also synthesize different traits. So starting with a white female base face, we can modulate it in terms of, actually, I forgot what was it attractive or trustworthy? Okay, it was attractive. So the second trait is trustworthy, from least trustworthy to the most trustworthy. Actually, not from the least, from less to more. And then threatening, from less threatening to more threatening. Do this for white male faces. Less attractive to more attractive. Less trustworthy to more trustworthy. Less threatening to more threatening. So we're actually in the process of building a demo on the web for my lab, such that anyone can, if they want, enter an image or use their webcam to take an image, and we'll modify your face for you along the desired trait to the extent you want. So we can do this for an Asian female face or Asian male face, and so on and so forth. Okay, we can also vary these faces according to how happy it looks, or older or younger, and so on and so forth. So that's visually kind of convincing and fun, maybe. But we can also do more quantitative analysis by looking at geometric features and see how they correlate with these different traits and these different LTAs. And then what's showing yellow here is the unique contribution of that particular geometric feature. What's in green is the cumulative total R-square so far. And so what we see is that, as you might expect for attractiveness, longer nose, larger eyes, happy demeanor, and femininity, especially in female faces, tend to contribute to higher attractiveness. But what surprised us really is the shorter chin. I had no idea. Did anyone know? I feel like I should connect up with like a plastic surgeon or cosmetic company for funding or something. But shorter chin alone explains 20% variance. Wow, who knew? So the next thing we looked at is, what are the facial features that matter for social perception versus similarity judgment? Are they the same, or are they overlapping, or are they totally different? And so the way we do this is we look at, we take the full AAM space, that we call X for shorthand, and Z represents just the top A features for similarity judgment. So these are the ones that really matter for similarity judgment. And yellow or orange here is just a deep neural net. It's 100 features. And what's in purple here is MDS, multidimensional scaling. And then we see we try to train the best linear model possible to predict human perception of different social traits like attractive, baby face, dominant, so on and so forth. And then what we see is actually, obviously X does the best. It's the full AAM. But Z does almost as well, and it's better than deep neural net as well as MDS. And the fact they're almost the same level of performance implies that social trait perception mostly depends on features differentiating individuals in terms of judging how similar faces are. But one exception is trustworthiness. You can see that blue and red are significantly different. So there's a big fraction of, there's a big drop in performance if you only use a feature to important for similarity judgment as opposed to whole face space of AAM. And when we visualize synthetic faces along the LTA within the subspace that's important for similarity judgment, as opposed to the bust LTA in the orthogonal space that's not important for similarity judgment, then you see something really interesting, which is that trustworthiness perception has two components, right? One that depends on individual identity, and one that depends on perhaps transient emotional state. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense because certain kinds of people may be just more trustworthy than other people. And so that's what this first part is pulling out. And the other component is that, well, if someone is in a good mood or they're positively disposed toward you, then that probably makes them more trustworthy as well, right? So trustworthiness should have both this individual identity component as well as this transient states component. And maybe it relates to the fact that, in fact, we know that in phase processing in the human brain, there is FFA, which mainly encodes structural features, and the superior temporal sulcus mainly encodes transient features, right? So in the brain, there also seems to be this segregation between these structural long-term features that are important for individual identification and these, or similarity judgment, and these more transient features that encode the current state. And social perceptions seem to depend on both components. And so we can do a similar thing to see how well these models capture emotion perception. So again, X is the full space, and Z is just the top 8 dimensions important for similarity judgment. And then we see that while Z is still better than the deep neural net and multidimensional scaling, now it's not nearly as good as the full space of all the facial features. And actually, it's surprising that emotional perception should depend on how individuals differ from each other at all. Because if you think about it, it should be invariant, right? Because we're talking about emotional expression. So whether someone looks happy or looks sad or looks angry or surprised, you would think it would be invariant with respect to the identity of the individual. Like, it shouldn't matter whose face you're looking at. But if we dig a little more closely, we see that for happy, for example, when we judge how happy a face looks, again, if you visualize the faces within the subspace of similarity judgment and orthogonal to it, there again has two components, right? So certain kinds of faces, maybe some people are just happier than other people. And that makes sense. So if you ask someone how happy does a face look, they're both thinking how happy is this person in general, as well as currently, does this person feel happy versus not happy, right? So even emotional expression judgment probably also has both of these structural and transient components as well. So next thing we looked at is how my information about social trait perception being encoded in the brain. So we were fortunate to have data shared by Freiwald and Cao. This is similar data that, actually the same data set that Josh talked about this morning, but we used for a different purpose. So we took the faces that the monkeys saw, there were 37 of them. We projected along the different LTAs for different traits. For example, this is the projection of the faces, that's what the brown bars represent, along the predicted ratings for attractiveness. So blue represents the training data set distribution, and orange or brown is the distribution of the ratings for this particular data set that the monkeys saw. And then we can look at, is there neural correlation in the response between the different neurons compared to where the faces lie along these axes to figure out is there neural encoding of the information relevant for these different social traits. And what we saw is that actually there's a very significant fraction of neurons that encode information significantly in terms of the correlation coefficient relative to with this red line is 95% confidence interval. So above that red line means that there's a significant fraction of the neural population that does encode that trait. So in fact, most of the social traits that we considered, whether it's social traits like personality impressions or demographics like gender, this is race, or age, and then orange is in the emotional expressions, all of these things seem to have encoding in the monkey face patch areas. So that raises kind of a mystery. Why do monkeys or monkey neurons care about human social perception of human faces? That seems really odd. And our interpretation actually is that the causality goes the other way around. It's that human social perception has developed on top of this face encoding scheme such that all you need is one more step, which is a linear decoding of the information that's already there to give rise to the different social trait perception that we do have. So the second part of the talk, I want to talk about attractiveness per se, but also its contextual modulation by task. So there's this classical phenomenon called beating averageness. Probably most of you have heard. So these are just faces average across women within different countries, and people tend to perceive the average face always more attractive than the original faces that the blends come from. And this is a very old phenomenon that's been known for over 100 years. So there have been some qualitative hypotheses suggest like symmetry or smoothness, but what psychologists see is that, in fact, this BIA effect also arises when people are judging how likable birds or fish or cars or even random dot patterns are, right? So clearly there's some more general cognitive mechanism. It's not just about symmetry or smoothness or health, the health status of the face suggested by the face. So related to this, there's also this phenomenon known as ugliness in averageness. I didn't come up with a name. If you take the blend of two different races, if you take a blend of faces from two different races, like Caucasian and Asian, people still find that more attractive. So it has a normal BIA effect, beating averageness effect. But if you ask people first to do a race categorization, is a Caucasian or is it Asian, then you find that the blend is actually less attractive than the parent faces. Same is true if you take a bigender blend. Or if you blend celebrities, for example, this one, people tend to find that less attractive than either of the original faces. So the standard account in this social psychology community is this is a disfluency effect or affect misattribution effect. So the idea being that when the discrimination gets difficult, you feel this negative affect and you misattribute that to your disliking of the face image. And that's what's causing you to dislike the face that's the most difficult to discriminate, which is the blend during the discrimination task. But that doesn't explain why BIA arises in the first place, and it's also not statistical. So me being a statistical, theoretical neuroscientist, I wanted to come up with a new theory. And so with my student Che Reali, we have been working on this coding efficiency model of why these effects arise. So the idea is that humans have a prior probability distribution over faces, which is learned through experience, which may or may not completely correctly describe the distribution of faces in the world. But importantly, it is, broadly speaking, most random dimensions, it is unimodal and, in fact, bell-shaped. So we define this typicality measure, which is just a log likelihood of the face under this distribution. And the idea is that a face becomes more likable when it's more statistically typical. And when you have this unimodal distribution, then obviously when you take two parent faces and blend them, the blends on average are going to have a higher log likelihood. And that is why blends are perceived to be more attractive. And then why UI arises, we postulate, is because of attentional focusing. So when you're doing a task like race discrimination, then you're attending to just a task-relevant subspace of the facial features. And when you do that categorization, then you should be in a subspace where the distribution is bimodal. That's the whole point. You're doing discrimination, so the distribution better be discriminable between one category versus the other, right? And in this space, if you take parent faces from the two different modes, then more likely than not, the blend is going to have lower log likelihood. Where again, we define typicality as log likelihood, but conditioned on the perceived category, the most probable category of the object. And how this relates to efficient coding, and I love this. This whole colloquium has been full of efficient coding, but it also applies to our work here, which is that actually log minus log likelihood is just a coding cost if the brain is efficient in coding facial stimuli. And so atypical stimuli should incur higher cost, right? And so maybe that leads to disliking. So that's kind of appealing, but you might want to ask why? Why should higher coding costs make you dislike it more? Well, there are different kinds of utilities. This is kind of speculative. But in the short term, we would expect that this kind of signal will help you to minimize energy use, right? So in the short term, these stimuli are aversive. So you avoid stimuli which cost a lot of energy and resources to represent. But in the long term, it is a learning signal. It allows you to learn a better statistical model of the world. And this is related to actually the concept of unexpected uncertainty that I worked on with Peter Diane during my thesis. And there also, uncertainty plays a dual role. It both downgrades the weight, the importance of a source of information due to uncertainty during inference in the current setting, but also upgrades the learning that's allocated to that same source of uncertainty. So to validate this model, we took real faces from this publicly available data set. We project along random axes, and it's almost always bell-shaped. But if you project along these very specific axes, which are obtained by linear discriminant analysis, now you see the distribution indeed bimodal, like we hypothesized for race and gender. And unsurprisingly, the model captures UIA in both cases. And we find that, in fact, the log likelihood of individual faces in the gender discrimination study correlates with the perceived attractiveness of faces. So it's not just an average effect. It actually is big enough effect for us to see it on the individual face level. And it's a pretty high correlation considering there are actually many other faces that influence attractiveness. For instance, the linear axis of attractiveness is separate from this. We also see that there's potentially a neural cost that's correlated with this. So the same Freiwald and Cao monkey neuron data, we find that the log likelihood of the images, face image, correlates with the average mean firing rate across all the neurons in the face patch areas. So we also find that in collaboration with Piotr Winkelmann at UCSD, that it's not only attractiveness, how much you like a face also affects how dominant the face looks, how trustworthy it looks, and general valence, like how positive of qualities you attribute to the face, as a function of the number of standard deviation away from the mean of the distribution. So it's not the actual featural discrepancy, it's the numbers, it's in units of standard deviation, right? So this really is a statistical effect. And just to remind you again, all these traits seem to have both the linear and quadratic component. The quadratic component is the statistical typicality effect, and the linear component is that, along the LTA, the face just looks more attractive in one direction, less attractive in the other direction. And the second result, which I don't have a figure for, is that we find that actually can induce UIA, this against averageness effect, in arbitrary face dimensions by exposing subjects to a statistical distribution that's bimodal during a learning paradigm. So, in fact, if you think about other contributors to mirror symmetry, maybe we can wrap them, not all of them, but some of them into this coding cost idea. So, as I mentioned, mirror symmetry actually contributes to attractiveness. But in fact, we see in neuroscience that there's a widespread existence of viewplane symmetric neural response across the dorsal and ventral streams. And in fact, viewplane symmetry implies, it implicitly assumes mirror symmetry. And any asymmetric deviation for this coding scheme will incur additional coding costs, right? If most of your neurons are assuming symmetry, then to encode the slight differences in the asymmetry between left and right half, that's going to cause some extra neural representational cost. And so symmetric coding is efficient because on average faces are symmetric, and when faces are asymmetric, they're asymmetric in different ways. And that's why the coding scheme doesn't take that into account by default. And another factor is lack of blemishes and wrinkles. So if you notice, all the model-generated faces on all these feature dimensions are very smooth. They don't have blemishes or wrinkles. And that's because an efficient representation should deprioritize blemish and wrinkles, which are different from person to person, face to face, right? So it's statistically efficient to ignore this just as a source of noise. And so again, blemishes and wrinkles require extra coding costs in addition to any relationship to age or health. And finally, if you're not convinced enough yet, I'd leave you with this, this idea that maybe our language actually tells us something about this topic as well, which is that if you consider in English, maybe you've noticed already, likely and likable actually have the same root. And you think, why? Why is likely more likable? But that's basically what the second part of the talk is about. But it's not only in English, it's also in German. Morgen is to like, and möglich is likely. So wow, that's two coincidences. But then there's also Latin, I don't really know Latin. So if Google Translate is to be trusted, that's the source. That's the encyclopedia these days, right? This word probabilis, which I also don't know how to pronounce, means both probable and proven, and which is synonym to likely and commendable, right? So perhaps we like likely objects or stimuli more because they're familiar, they're being proven, right? And so they represent less risk. Okay, so I think I'm out of time, so I'll skip over this. And just acknowledge the people in my lab who helped work on this, especially my PhD student, Che Reale, who did a lot of the modeling work, and Sophia, who's also here. They're both here, who worked on the neural data analysis, and as well as all of the other different resources that made this research possible. Thank you.